On a recent trip out to John Brewer Reef, the amazing John Brewer Reef, I was doing some monitoring for the Museum of Underwater Art, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to talk about. What was the story I was going to tell? And I thought, you know what? There's a lot of people who come out here and don't get the opportunity to dive on the Museum of Underwater Art. And so I thought I'd take you on a little tour of this amazing underwater art installation and artificial reef. It's pretty spectacular. When we first dived into the coral greenhouse triangular structure, which is the main feature of the Museum of Underwater Art, having been out there for a few months, I was staggered by the amount of Dendrophilia soft corals, those purpley, reddy and white soft corals hanging from the ceilings like natural chandeliers. And so I was sort of immediately drawn to them, and we did a swim along, and they were just spectacular, encompassing the entire length of the roof line of the main structure of the Museum of Underwater Art. The whole site has been a collaboration with many different individuals, but it is the brainchild of Jason Taylor, who is the primary artist. And we were out there, my colleague Georgia Hodgson and I were out there doing some citizen science monitoring on not only the sculptures, but also on the marine life at the artificial reef and at John Brewer. You can see the amount of marine life that this location is attracting. These fish are enjoying the protection that's being offered by the sculptures. You've got a batfish at the top there being cleaned by a cleaner wrasse. Some sweet lips hovering down near the benches, and to the right you've got an orange-spined sea urchin. That was a surgeon fish, not a sea urchin. Sorry about that. You can see these sculptures here, these vases and bowl-like structures. These have been designed to receive coral transplants, but part of our research experiment was to transplant corals into only one side of the structure and see if that had a difference on how the sculptures looked, whether more fish aggregated to one side or the other. And based on the evidence of this video, it definitely was more on the side that didn't have coral than does. You can see there's a lot of debris on the benches there as well, showing predation by different, probably invertebrates like octopus and things like that might be preying on some of the barnacles. And you can see some of the growth on the sculptures here. These are sculptures of actual people. A number of indigenous members of our community were body sculpted to create these sculptures as part of the installation. You can see some of our coral transplants that have been added to the sculptures here. Some of them are doing quite well. Others are a little bit compromised, but generally survival has been very high. I definitely like this little branching Echinopora coral colony. He is very cool with his own basal attachment. On the floor of the coral greenhouse, you can see there's a variety of different sea cucumbers. These are like vacuum cleaners, hoovers, sucking up any organic matter that is, and detritus that falls onto the sea floor, or in this case, the floor of the museum. Other animals, fish and the like, using the cracks and crevices of the sculpture and the installation as protection and hiding places and places to escape from me with my camera. The installation was designed to highlight reef restoration techniques such as coral gardening, but also highlight Townsville as a region for marine science, hence some of the sculptures that have been implemented. Lots of pelagic fish tend to enjoy the protection offered by the installation itself. Here we've got some barracuda hanging out in the sculpture, and obviously as I'm swimming toward them they're heading away, but not in any great hurry. Outside the main sculpture, the coral greenhouse, we've got a couple of what we call planter boxes, and some of them we have left free as part of our research experiment. We haven't transplanted any coral into these, but you can definitely see how the soft corals are starting to propagate quite expansively across many of the elements of the coral greenhouse. Colourful surf parrotfish and a couple of triple-tail wrasse enjoying each other's company, or just not enjoying each other's company. And you can even see in the planter box where we have planted corals, many of the coral colonies, many acroporid species corals are doing well, but there's been a lot of recruitment, self-recruitment by these soft corals. So we didn't transplant those. They've migrated, or not migrated, but settled on these locations by themselves. Lots of small coral associated fish living within the branches. A couple of small tobies there, but I don't remember their exact names. Some Psolopora corals, the more bushy one that was just seen there. And we put this cage over this planter box because we've had some trouble with predation by bumphead parrotfish in some of our research experiments. And so we decided to do a little micro experiment and see if it helped reduce predation by the bumpheads. But we haven't had any predation on the corals in those planter boxes. You can see the marbled sea cucumber enjoying that frame, and the emperor fish that just swam away, but was obviously enjoying the space and protection provided by that mesh frame that we've put over the top of those coral colonies. Some of the artwork and the individual sculptures outside of the coral greenhouse are starting to be consumed by other marine organisms. I've already spoken about the proliferation by soft corals, and you can see this sitting gardener has almost like a jacket or shoulder pads of soft corals growing on the shoulders, the back, the seats that they're sitting on, and really starting to transform that sculpture into something definitely biomorphic in nature. The entrance to the coral greenhouse has this young lady holding a pot with a coral colony that's been planted in it. It looks like the coral colony is actually smaller than when we propagated it, and I'm wondering if it's been compromised by its location and that divers maybe come through and bump into it. But what I found really interesting about this sculpture was the proliferation of encrusting sponge across the entire head and facial area, creating this biomorphic map which just looks spectacular, with all those lines and streaks and almost look like veins. We planted some corals on the base of the trees that exist outside of the coral greenhouse, and some of these look like they're doing really well. But what's been really cool and really exciting with the trees and all of the sculptures outside of the coral greenhouse has been the natural recruitment by a variety of different coral colonies. Lots of Psolopora colonies, like these ones on the branches of this leafy tree, that are doing really well. I think when we did our research, we found there were about 5 recruits per square metre of installation when we did our annual monitoring, and it shows here there's some really amazing colonies. There's also a bunch of sea squirts or ascidians growing, those little green floppy circles that you can see on the ends of those branches there. And so they are an invertebrate, tunicate, a filter feeder. You can see on that tree just how many self-recruiting corals there are. Some of the sculptures, as I mentioned, we have preferentially or selectively transplanted corals onto, and some we haven't. You can see more of that encrusting sponge on the legs of this gardener with their watering can. Some of the colonies planted in the base of the sculpture are doing amazingly well, are growing and developing quite strongly. And this sculpture also has some of those self-recruiting, naturally recruiting Pocillopora, that one in a very interesting position on the backside of that sculpture. And you can see on some of these sculptures we've actively transplanted some coral colonies. This particular acroporid colony planted in that bowl or planter box, you can see has actually made an attachment onto the face of the coral. We probably did that on purpose so that the coral could make multiple attachments and be much more secure over time rather than being attached at one particular base. A number of self-recruiting Pocillopora colonies. Again, this sculpture is on the other side of the floor plan of the Museum of Underwater Art, so it wouldn't have had corals transplanted into it as part of our research experiment. But there's a number of self-recruiting colonies, as well as a trochus shell in the bowl that he's holding there, which is pretty cool. It was really cool to see the number of fish inhabiting the site, lots of grazers like parrotfish and surgeonfish and that butterfly fish just going out of screen there. So the butterfly fish often hang around when there's good coral cover, but you also get lots of grazers when there's lots of turf algae and other elements of interest to them, and they are really important for keeping that turf algae to a reasonable length and making sure that they're opening up available space for other organisms to self-recruit, such as these coral colonies and the ascidians that I spoke about before. You can see them munching away on the turf algae growing on these palm leaves of the stainless steel tree. So dive boats go out to this site, at least twice a week, weather permitting, and a lot of people are getting to experience, the changes that are happening at this site in real time. It was completely different from the last time I visited, mostly because of the proliferation and growth of not only our transplanted coral colonies, but also the soft corals that are growing, like these dendrophiliads, growing on the floats, holding the trees vertical. It was just spectacular natural creations augmenting the artificial creations created by man and the artists who have developed the site, and we really expect it to change and grow and become even more interesting as time goes on. So if you get a chance to get out there and check it out, I couldn't recommend it more highly.